Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The government pays out billions of dollars every year in federal contracts for things like building roads, building bridges, and sewer systems. But the executives in charge of those contracts are using our tax money to pay their employees poverty wages. I'm joined now by attorneys Howard Nations and Kerry Jardine to tell us what's happening. Howard, it looks like American taxpayers are having to underwrite really low-paying, low-benefit jobs all over this country that just isn't helping the recession, isn't helping the economy at all.
Very true, Mike. You would think that the biggest cause of the people trying to reach the middle class and their failure to do so would be the low wages at McDonald's or Walmart. But the fact of the matter is that the largest single contingent of workers in the country who are underpaid as a group are those people who are funded by taxpayer dollars of money going to contractors. Taxpayers are fueling inequality. In 2012, there were $446.5 billion paid to contractors that was distributed to 2.2 million workers. Now, we have certain contingencies, which, as they should, engineers, doctors, scientists who work for these contractors who are well paid. But hundreds of billions of dollars go to companies that are paying very low wages. They're paying $12 or less per hour. And at the same time, many companies are paying highly exorbitant salaries to their execs.
Kerry, let me go to you on this. It's not that it's just wrong. It's not that it's just morally wrong, ethically wrong, that we should be paying government workers who really keep our infrastructure together in so many ways. It's not just wrong, but it causes harm to the economy, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that kind of one of the principal issues here?
Well, Mike, since the Davis-Bacon Act in 1931, the government has had the responsibility to set the standard for fair labor practices. And when you have low-wage earners, and Howard is right, when you have 560,000 federal workers that are earning poverty-level wages, it absolutely hurts the economy. They have less money to put into the economy. They pay less in taxes. They take more in terms of government benefits. They don't have the ability to move into the middle class. They don't have the ability to buy houses. I mean, it just ripples through the economy,
right.
And it does. It has a devastating effect on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the whole idea here, Kerry, that we want to rebuild our middle class? What are some of the Howard? What are some of the areas that we see this occurring, where we're taking taxpayers' dollars, we're giving it to contractors? In other words, government has just gone crazy with wanting to hire contractors to do virtually everything. So we take this money, we give it to the contractor, and then the contractor is involved in a race to the bottom on how little they can pay the worker. What are some areas we see this?
Well, the areas where we see this are in healthcare. They're in SBA-supported, Small Business Association-supported companies. A very large contingent of this comes from federal construction grants, and all the sorts of building maintenance, all the federal buildings that you see, all the federal parks, all those things that have to be maintained. Many of those are maintained through contractors. The private prison system, for example. The government pays the contractor pays the employees. And they're just simply allowing the employees at that level to fall through the cracks.
So, Kerry, if I heard what you said, we do have the Davis-Bacon Act, 1931. The purpose of that was to say, and then we have the executive orders that came after that, and the purpose was to say that we need to have laws that mandate companies that we give as taxpayers, that we give money to, that they're going to at least do something that we can be proud of in taking care of workers. I mean, employment practices, employment standards, ways that we take care of them in retirement, pensions, health care. All of that was contemplated in the 1931 Davis-Bacon Act, but we don't pay any attention to that anymore, do we?
You know, it's been eroded over time. In 1995, Congress came in and started to look at the level of executive pay, and they made some good strides there. But the problem The problem is that the executives for these federal contractors were paid $24 billion in compensation last year alone. And while employing workers, over 500,000 workers that are earning poverty level wages, the problem is that there's an incentive for the executives to have a workforce that is at the poverty level wages because more of the money flows into their pockets, and it just creates this continued inequality between the top 1%, the rich, and the low wage earners. And that's what the Davis-Bacon Act, going back to the Great Depression, coming out of that and during that, they just recognized the government has to be the standard bearer on this. They have to set the example of high labor standards, people that are working for America, building the infrastructure here in America. They need to be earning wages that allow them to move into the middle class. But there seems to be an erosion, Michael. You're absolutely right. There seems to be an erosion on that's creating some serious problems.
Let's talk about. Let's break this down. I mean, you've got a whole spectrum of occupations, as Howard pointed out. You got the military person who sews military uniforms. You've got hospital aides. You've got security guards that are contracted to protect public buildings. You have that food cart worker out at the National Zoo or other places around the country. You have so many things that we don't even think about that are all contracted by private industry, but taxpayers are paying that contractor. And we've almost forgotten the idea that we can say to that contractor, you know what? Part of the bidding process is going to be how you treat your workers. That's going to be part of it. Howard, you mentioned something I'm very interested in. You say that there's been people at the bottom of this process, the person actually doing the day-to-day work, they're not getting paid an awful lot of money, but people at the top are seeing windfalls. How is the CEO pay at the top? How do we gauge and how do we create the amount of money that those people at the very top are getting? They are getting huge windfalls, aren't they?
Well, what happened was the executive order that was entered under President Johnson actually tried to cap executive pay. Unfortunately, they kept it at the high executive salaries, the highest executive salaries in the private sector. You know what's happened to executive salaries in the private sector. They've gone through the roof. Now, the key to this is really that even though they are capped at this level, they're not capped at that being their total income. In other words, the company can pay them anything they want to. The only cap is what the taxpayers, how much the taxpayer money can be used to pay that $750,000 that some of them make. So,
so in other words, Howard, what you're saying is there was a day when you could have, when a law might have, an executive order might have been relevant to say, look, you can only pay the executive that has a contract for the government. You can only pay that executive a certain scale based on the rest of executives in the business. And when that was done, these executive bonuses weren't, $1 billion, $2 billion, $500 million. Some of these ridiculous, outrageous CEO pays that we see now. Overnight, that changed, and now because of that, a corporation, a subcontractor corporation who's getting taxpayers' money can justify paying that CEO as much as they want, basically, right?
Yes, they can justify paying them as much as they want, but the real key to it is the cap is how much of the executive salary and compensation can be out of taxpayer dollars. So they could lower the cap and the executives could still be paid whatever the company thinks they're worth, but they could put the true cap on the taxpayer dollars. That's what needs to be lowered.
And that's been proposed. I've followed this a little bit. That has actually been proposed by some legislators who say we have to rethink this because the disparity between people at the top and people at the bottom is not just a function of what's happening in the private sector. Now we have government contractors that are doing the same thing, creating a disparity to where the middle class has disappeared. Kerry, what are things we can do? What are things that the U.S. government can do as far as making sure that taxpayer money does help build a middle class by not paying workers Walmart wages if they work for a government contractor?
One of the probably the most common sense approaches to this that hopefully is going to get some is going to pick up speed is capping the executive pay. The President of the United States makes $400,000 a year. All right, the Vice President makes $230,000 a year. The average median income in a household is $50,000 a year. So you bring down the executive pay for federal contract work, as Howard indicated. That doesn't affect the overall. That doesn't determine the overall executive pay. But if you put a cap on how much can be reimbursed per employee, bring it down from $750,000 down to $230,000. The compensation.
What our vice
president is earning. What you end up doing is you end up increasing the hourly wage to these poverty level workers by $7 an hour, $14,000 a year. You're giving them a chance to buy a house. You're giving them a chance to move into the middle class. And the fact of the matter is, at the executive level, you're not, relative to what they're earning, they can give up some of that income to help these low poverty level workers have a chance.
Right, because Kerry, really, well, Howard, you mentioned earlier, let me ask you this, Howard. This is something that's not happening in just the low, this is happening in the top tier of government contractors, the people doing technical government contracting, building jets, building high-ticket items for the government. This is happening all the way to the top, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's happening even in the aerospace industry, for example. But the major problems exist in three areas. In 2012, the federal government spent $30 billion in federal construction contracts. They spent $74 billion in federal infrastructure. And the SBA created 66,000 construction jobs with their loans. But in those three industries, in those three areas alone, there were 80,000 construction jobs where people are being paid less than the $12 per hour. They could address that. Then they could also address the areas like aerospace and the other areas that you're talking about, where even at the high end, the people at the top are making the good money, but they're very few. They're a very small percentage.
Startling numbers, an important story. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Mike.